What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. Today we got a big time episode. We are going to be going over the Steelers 53-man roster. Going to be going over some kind of projections, who we think is going to make the 53. Going to go over position group by position group, give you guys the strengths of the weaknesses kind of from top to bottom. But just kind of first off, I'm joined by my Steelers Draft Talk co-host, my good friend, Nick Martin. Nick, how we doing, my good brother?
I'm doing great, man. It's always a great day when I get to talk ball with you. And, we got a good episode upcoming. We're going to talk about the 53-man roster, and I'm looking forward to it.
Heck yeah, brother. Yeah, it's been a while, man. I know you were on here. You were the first reoccurring guest
Mhm.
for the pod, so that's interesting. But yeah, definitely excited to talk some ball. Get to this 53-man roster. This is something I've been wanting to do for the last couple of weeks. Just kind of getting the time to put out a lengthy video has been a little bit challenging. But just before we get started, guys, y'all know what it is. Please make sure that you like the video. Drop me a comment. Sub to the channel, all that stuff is greatly appreciated on my end. So let's get started, man. I guess we'll start off with quarterbacks, man. I feel like that's where we kind of gotta make the money. I know where that's everybody's interested in that. I don't think there's very much to talk about in terms of maybe roster controversy. We have a starter. We know Kenny Pickett's going to be the guy. It's not like last year where we're kind of in a quarterback battle or anything like that. But Kenny Pickett's the guy. Mitch Trubisky restructured his deal to come back as the backup, and then Mason Rudolph kind of is the third guy. So I guess my first question is: do you see anything changing with Mason as QB3, or do you think that's pretty locked in?
I think it's pretty locked in as we stand here right now. I know there's some talk about Tanner Morgan maybe being a guy who could surprise during camp. There was some buzz around him at OTAs. Overall, I think it's not likely to change. I think he's more likely to be a guy they fit on the practice squad most likely. So, and it makes sense for them to carry three quarterbacks, especially considering both Mason and Mitch are fairly well tenured as well.
Yeah, absolutely, man. Yeah, I think for Mason too, we're just talking about a guy that is on a very, very minimal contract at this
Mhm.
point too. So it's not like they're going to save a bunch of money going with Tanner Morgan over him. So he's that. That's the thing for me. I think that the top three is really set for that group. But I do like the idea of keeping Mitch in house to give Kenny Pickett, two veteran backup quarterbacks. I think that experience is really nice. Trubisky, he started over, I think, 50 career games now in the NFL. Mason has some starting experience as well. For young guys, man, that haven't, seen it all, done it all yet, kind of. Mitch has made the playoffs. He's been in big games like that. I think that kind of experience is pretty invaluable. Are you surprised that he was kind of brought back and that he wanted to stay? Or did you kind of see this playing out like this the whole way?
I think he saw that the grass isn't greener on the other side of the pasture, and he realized that he might not get that opportunity. That a lot of times, people don't understand this about quarterbacks. They're very prideful in their abilities. They want to be able to prove what they can prove. And when he found out his market was as small as it was, he probably realized, Pittsburgh is giving me, a good home. They've done as much as they can. This makes a lot of sense to come back and stay with what I know.
Yeah. And definitely, I think the backup quarterback thing is important too. It always is, but with Kenny having a couple concussions last season, that's always something to monitor. And having a veteran in the room, I think is definitely a good thing. Just as far as Pickett goes, man, let's talk a little bit about him in general, and then some of the things that we're looking forward to seeing maybe in year two. I was writing an article kind of early this morning about just maybe some areas of improvement, things that we want to see in year two. But I wanted to get your thoughts on that. What do you want to see Pickett improve on kind of after he finished last season pretty strong in the last couple games?
I think everyone's harping on the same thing, and that's just staying in structure more often. A lot of times there were plays open within structure, and he opted to go outside the pocket for whatever reason, and sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't. Even on the play, against Baltimore where he finds Najee Harris and they win the game. There were guys open in structure, and he he put himself into pressure by running outside, even though Dan Moore had the he definitely had the outside protected there. But yeah, that's the big thing with Kenny Pickett, just being able to stay on script more often. It would also make it a little bit easier to evaluate Matt Canada's system, because a lot of times a lot of his play designs can be really mundane, but there's a lot of instances where guys might be open, and we don't always get to see what the result of those plays might have been. And keeping the offense in a rhythm is one of the most important things, being able to evaluate both the scheme and the quarterback itself, which is why when you have a rookie quarterback and you have a bit of a controversial play caller, it makes for an interesting it makes for
Dynamic.
a dynamic going into year two, especially because I think a lot of people are very on edge about Canada, but there's a lot of optimism around Pickett. I definitely think there needs to be a little bit slightly tempered expectations for Pickett, but I definitely understand the optimism of his growth going into year two.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think, the pocket management has been a big thing really going back to college. I mean, we've talked about that at length, on you know, the All Steelers channel. We talked about that at length really on Twitter. Just he has a propensity to, scramble, kind of go out the back door, roll to his left, roll to his right. You would like to see him start to kind of, okay, let me hitch up in the pocket. Not only will that, like you said, help some plays develop down the field without having him to always kind of resort to being a creator, um, but it also helps some of those longer developing route concepts. Maybe let him hit the backside dig every once in a while. Um, but I just look around the NFL too. Like I think the third read. I heard a good quote about this from Nate Tice, but he was talking about how the third read's dead in the
Yeah.
NFL, and that's just a lot of these quarterbacks that are creators or good athletes. It's really 1-2, let me scramble, and that's pretty much what Pickett was last year. And I'm not saying that you can't live like that. I think that over the course of a career, it's really difficult to, because I talk about this a little bit when I do the film room stuff. I just think in general, when you're constantly having to go into that creator mode, those throws are not difficult. They're difficult, man. They're not easy throws all the time, and it's hard to kind of live life on the edge like at 100% of the time. You'd like to see him start to be able to kind of work some other areas of the field without always having to escape the pocket. But there was definitely some encouraging stuff over the last month of the season. I'm hopeful that a full off season with the offense, because this is going to be valuable time for them to see. Okay, we figured out last season. Okay, these are the concepts that he likes. This is kind of the sequencing that he likes, the things that he excels in, and how can we allow him to grow? Like one of the areas that I want them to, he was dead last or near the bottom in pretty much every category in terms of like work in the middle of the field. They've got to figure out a way. Canada's system is not the greatest for accessing that. And Pickett really wasn't the greatest when they did try to do it. So that would be the other thing for me is, throwing with some more anticipation and getting to the all areas of the field. But there was definitely some encouraging stuff down the stretch, and I'm hopeful, that we can see him, continue that momentum into year two. So I definitely think that there's warranted optimism and excitement, just because of how he finished. And we'll see, man. I think the Canada thing is definitely worth mentioning. It's going to be a huge talking point, really, if he does start out slow or if he doesn't, kind of reach some of these lofty expectations that I feel like he's developed in the fan base. But,
I wouldn't overreact after week one, though, when they play the 49ers.
yeah, that one's gonna be tough, man. I've already said this on Twitter a couple of times. I've watched some Nick Bosa stuff already, just in terms of like some pre-scouting, and dude, he is unbelievable. So I'm praying for whoever Bosa flips sides. He goes left and right, but
Yeah.
praying for whoever's at left tackle. That's gonna be a tough opening matchup. But All right, enough about the quarterbacks. That was a good one. I think we're excited about Pickett, and we feel pretty confident in that group. Let's go to the running back spot. Najee Harris, obviously, the returning starter for that group. And then, Jalen Warren, I think, is pretty much locked into the 53 as well. Who do you kind of see? Do you see them keeping three backs, four backs? And then who do you kind of see taking that last spot?
I think it's most likely going to be Anthony McFarland. He just provides a little bit more juice compared to like even Jalen Warren per se, just in terms of explosive play capabilities. But definitely the guy to keep an eye on. And this goes back to what I heard, what I read from OTAs, particularly from Nick Farabaugh, who jotted down some of his observations, was Alfonso Graham, and he seemed to be making a little bit of a buzz. It's always important though, watch when the pads come on, because backs on backers a lot of times, that's the big thing. We want to see running backs pass protect. We want to see them play on special teams and make tackles, because that's the way onto the roster, especially when you're on the bubble. So I think right now I see them taking three, and I think Graham could fit on like the practice squad right now.
Yeah, I think three is a good number. I definitely am excited to see who wins that last spot. I think McFarland. I agree with you that that juice that he offers is kind of different, right? Like that burst that he has in the open field. I noted this. I did a film room on McFarland. I think it was like a week or two ago, but really limited playing time last year. He only played in the Indianapolis game in the regular season, really. But um, Ant really looked better to me last
Yeah.
year just because I thought he looked more decisive. And when he did get a helmet, they did some creative things to get him the ball in space, throwing him screens, getting him out in the route tree. I think the one question I have with really all those guys is, are any of those guys capable in pass protection? I have some questions about McFarland there. I'm not really sure about the rookies. Graham, is it Hagens? Is it a veteran that's not even on the roster? Could Benny Snell be brought back? Special teams is going to be huge there. And that's the only reason I say, about Snell or a veteran. If they could get a guy, close to the vet men or something like that, I think they're going to give the young guys a shot, to start off camp and see who can kind of claim or seize that job. But if they don't get it done, I definitely think the running back market could potentially be explored for a cheap vet.
Yeah.
Um, let's talk a little bit about the just kind of the dynamic between Jalen Warren and Najee Harris. Last year, it was rookie year. Najee Harris, was on the field for like something crazy. It was like 84% of his snaps or something crazy like that. Last year was much more normal in comparison to his peers around the league. I think it was about 66, 67, 33 for the Harris and Warren split. Do you see that kind of 2-to-1 ratio being similar this year? You see it being different, weighted one way or another? What are your thoughts on that?
I could see it being about 60-40 overall. I think Jalen Warren, gives. I've noted this comparison for a little bit, but it's really similar to the Chargers backfield a few years ago when they had Melvin Gordon, the first round pick, and then they had undrafted free agent Austin Eckler. There's just a lot of similarities between Eckler's game and Warren in terms of contact balance, the ability in the receiving game. But Najee, he offers a lot in that area as well. It's just the big thing that people don't. There's a lot of controversy around Najee, particularly on Twitter. So if you're discussing with the analytics or the fantasy community, because there's a lot of advanced statistics like rushing yards over expectation, where he does not necessarily come out on top. But I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that, one, he was playing with a really bad foot at the beginning of the year, and it showed. His decision making was even worse than it was usually. There was a lot of times where he was hesitating, and the offensive line is not that good of a run blocking unit in my overall opinion. I think a lot of that is a little undersold, and when you compare a backup to the main starter, a lot of times, the main starter gets a lot heavier boxes overall, and teams are just way more keyed in on their tendencies as well. So a lot of times the backup will end up scoring a lot better. But I definitely think the Steelers have a good problem on their hands, and that's a good thing. because Jalen Warren is very capable as a runner, but he's also one of the best pass protectors maybe in the league. I mean, he was exceptional as a rookie when it came to pass protecting. Najee definitely, I wouldn't say he's bad in that area, but he definitely stands out, more as a runner
Yeah.
and as a receiver at times as well. But both backs very capable, really good problem to have on your hands unless you're trying to draft in fantasy for fantasy purposes, but that's not why we're here.
Right. Yeah, we'll leave that to the fantasy experts. Yeah, I think it is an interesting conversation because I read, I'm a film and numbers guy, right? Like I try to tie them together. I think that's
Yeah.
the best way to take an analytical approach to the game. Having said that, some of these advanced numbers for running backs, I'm just not sure how much they matter. And that's not me trying to be completely dismissive of them. I just I don't know. There's so many different factors that go into it that some of the stats that I see, I'm just like, is this a running back stat or is this a team stat? You know what I'm saying? And
Mhm.
I know every stat has flaws, but one of the things I like about Warren, just I pointed this out not too long ago, but you mentioned the Eckler comparison, but Jalen averaged 3.08 yards after contact per attempt. That was right in between Christian McCaffrey and Jonathan Taylor last year for like 20th or 21st in the league, according to Pro Football Focus. Jalen did provide some splash off the bench, and mainly the biggest thing for me is just I want to see the Steelers get to the playoffs, right? And we kind of saw what Najee's body looked like towards the end of the season, his rookie year, when the Steelers kind of limped into the playoffs after that winning streak late. He just didn't have anything left in the tank, man. I mean, playing 85% of the snaps it's just not the NFL way anymore. I mean, there is no such thing really as bell cow running backs that are, taking 400 touches in a season. Like those guys don't really exist. And if they do, it's, you're pretty special backs. And I think that just Jalen being able to take some of the load off of Najee could help prolong his career and keep him fresher for when, we hope the Steelers are going to be playing into January next season. So I think the split is fine. I anticipate it being pretty much the same. I think Warren will take some of the third down work from Harris, but it'll probably still be Harris's show more often than not, which I think that's fine. You mentioned that Harris has definitely had some of the, we'll just call it less than ideal circumstances
Mhm.
in his first two seasons, with the, less than ideal run blocking units. But I think that should get better. We'll talk a little bit about the addition of Broderick Jones, the addition of Darnell Washington. But I think this is the best group that he's played behind this year, Isaac Samalo. So I'm excited to see what he looks like. Hopefully he can make it through camp this year completely healthy and we're not dealing with any nagging injuries entering week one. But,
Yeah.
Najee should be in for a big year. This is, year three, man. Tomlin talks about that year three jump he expects from his young players. This is also the year where the Steelers kind of have to figure out if they're going to pick up the fifth year option for him. So that's also going to be really important. They'll have to make that decision next spring. So excited about Najee though. I think he's going to have a good year, and I think he's really going to be the engine behind this offense. I think that they have a clear idea of what they want this thing to be, and I think they want this thing to be very run heavy. They want to establish that on the ground and kind of lean on the run game to help their young quarterback. So. Um, but yeah, I feel pretty solid about that unit.
Yeah.
Let's move on to the receivers. I think there's some really interesting discussions to be had. I think the top three are pretty much set in stone. You got Deontay Johnson, George Pickens, Allen Robinson, and then after that, I feel like it gets pretty interesting. I think Calvin Austin is a lock to make the roster, assuming he's healthy. I think they have plans for him, but he's got to get on the field and stay on the field. If he gets hurt or something like that, I think that could get a little bit dicey. Um, but let's talk about some of the guys, kind of fighting. Do you see them keeping five? Do you see them keeping six? Who are some of the guys you're looking for at the end of the roster to kind of make the 53?
I'm split between whether or not they keep both Akeem Butler and Miles Boykin because Boykin was such a key contributor as a special teamer. He was just very good in that area in terms of being, in terms of his abilities as a gunner and just being able to consistently down punts and make tackles. It was a huge aspect of his game, but there's definitely something different about Hakeem Butler in terms of what he could offer as a potential receiver as opposed to Boykin. And I think this is a little, this bears noting, but Hakeem Butler, the biggest thing I'm going to be watching for in preseason and training camp is whether or not he's making plays on special teams, because I think that is the best way he can make the roster, because I think we know what type of ability he has as a receiver, but a lot of times that ability is not enough to get you onto the roster, especially if you're like a camp signee and you're like on the bubble in these circumstances, because they want guys who can contribute immediately. So I think it's going to be between them. Just a little, I'll note this a little bit, but Des Fitzpatrick, he made some plays and OTAs for what it's worth, and there's definitely going to be some competition for sure for that final receiver spot. I definitely think Robinson, Pickens, Johnson, and Calvin Austin together are all locks, because a lot of people might say Austin might not be a lock, but I think they were really excited about what they had with him last year in training camp, and they were really bummed about that injury that happened, because they were really excited what he was doing. A lot of receivers were not really doing much in training camp that year, and Pickens and Austin, they ended up picking up the slack very much, and you could tell they were really excited about what they saw. So I'm expecting big things from Calvin Austin
Yeah.
if he can play.
Yeah, just kind of hitting on some of the guys, man. Miles Boykin was seventh on the team in special teams snaps last season. He was tied for second on the team in tackles. Everyone above him that played more snaps on special teams last year, except Connor Hayward, is all off this roster. There is a lot of turnover on the end of the roster in terms of the special teams units. Danny Smith is going to be working with a lot of new faces. You think about some of the guys that have been kind of staples of that unit really in years past: Derek Watt, Miles Killebrew, Benny Snell Jr., Marcus Allen. Those types of guys aren't really in the fold right now. So there's going to be a lot of change. And I think that Boykin's ability, like you said, to be a gunner, 9 tackles on special teams, that can't be understated from a backup. And the thing is, between him and Butler, even if we're potentially excited about the unknown that is Hakeem Butler right now, he's going to have to really, really stand out, be damn near unguardable, honestly, on offense if he's going to make this team without being like a really big special teams contributor. Because how's he going to get a helmet if everybody's healthy in front of him and he's not playing special teams? You're not going to dress a fifth receiver if he's not helping you in some form or fashion, barring an injury. So that's the big thing for me, I think, with Butler is, yeah, he's got to impress on offense, but we got to find something else that he can do in order to, get a helmet and help us on game days too. So, in terms of Calvin, man, I saw him in person last year, and there wasn't none of these cats that was checking him one-on-ones. I mean, Pickens was, still in the show. He was very much looking as advertised in training camp last year. But when I saw Austin, that speed, that agility is very, very real. And, he was killing people in one-on-ones. And I try not to get too excited about that stuff because I know how heavily geared towards the offense or the receivers that drill is. But, he was absolutely cooking, Arthur Millette, Cam Sutton, he was winning reps pretty much against anybody. So I think the thing about Austin that's exciting, you mentioned, you were really, really high on him, but he just adds a different dynamic to this group. His speed, being able to run that sub 4.3, kind of speed is different. And I think if you can get him on the field and get him some touches, because he was a legit route runner in college. He played on the outside. This dude was a heavy, heavy producer at receiver. But I think that
press a lot.
Yeah, and I think that big playability, man, could potentially be a really good thing for the Steelers offense that's really kind of searching for more ways to get explosives beyond, George Pickens' back shoulders. So excited about him. let's talk a little bit about the dynamics between Deontay Johnson, George Pickens, Allen Robinson. First, how do you kind of see the distribution of labor kind of panning out in terms of, snap alignment, kind of the ways that these guys are going to be featured?
I think overall Deontay Johnson will be playing mostly on the outside as the flanker, because a lot of times when you see, he's their best press man beater, he's their best route runner by far. He earns the most targets for a reason. It's because the guy is consistently creating separation. The big thing with George Pickens, there could be of a little bit more of a split between him and Allen Robinson, between playing on the outside and maybe playing in a little bit in the slot, because we did see some instances where Pickens was actually playing in the slot down the stretch last year, especially when they traded Claypool, because they kind of did it out of necessity. And a lot of the thing, that makes him a huge attribute, makes him a huge fit there, even though I think he's a better fit as an X receiver along the outside, tied down, as opposed, you know, is his blocking. And
Hmm.
that's the big thing. Like, it can create a lot, in the run game in that regard. And I definitely think there'll definitely be a little bit of a split there. I think Pickens will mostly be playing on the outside, though. What I'm interested to see is how many snaps Calvin Austin can end up getting if he does make the roster, obviously, because I do think he just provides way too different of a skill set compared to these guys in terms of just being able to stretch a defense. And I think that can really open it up for these guys underneath and just create a lot more space for this offense to operate with.
Yeah, without a doubt, man. I think with Pickens in general, he was one of the best deep threats and contested catch guys last season. He hauled in 68% of his contested catch targets
Crazy.
last year as a rookie, which is an absurd number. Um, but even if that regresses some, I think that we're all expecting him to take like a nice step forward in terms of his route running. They're gonna hopefully expand his route tree, allow him to do some more things than just run verticals up the sideline all day. And I'm excited about that. It's important to note, man, George was only 21 years old last year. I mean, this is very much a kid in terms of his development. He's got a long track in front of him, and I'm really excited about what that looks like. In terms of Deontay, man, I'm actually putting together a little bit of a Deontay kind of film room. Was cutting up some videos earlier, but I think Deontay, man, I know he's polarizing in the fan base, but you need that guy that's kind of your bucket getter on the outside. That if other teams are going to be willing to play man to man coverage, is this guy going to win one on ones with whoever they put out there? It doesn't matter if it's a number
Yeah.
one corner, if it's a number two corner, or whatever. If he's big, if he's small, if he's fast, if he's long, like, it doesn't really matter to Deontay. He's going to beat those guys one on one. I know he can be frustrating at times. There's some
Particularly
untimely drops, the
after the
penalties
catch
after
last
the
year.
catch. There's some different things like that. But in terms of just creating separation, and that's the thing too, I think people are wanting, because of how exciting Pickens' rookie year was, I think people are kind of wanting, like, okay, can we shift some of these targets away from Johnson to Pickens? And I think that you got to be careful with that, because yes, you can game plan, and you should be game planning to get your best players the football. But at the end of the day, man, the quarterback's eyes are always going to find the guys that are always the most open. And when you're going back and looking at the film, man, Deontay's just always open. People are wondering, how does this guy end up getting 150 targets a year? Well, if you look at the film, like, he's open a lot. And that's the thing. When you're a consistent separator, quarterbacks like wide open throwing windows. They don't like throwing into tight coverage a lot. Those back shoulders, the Pickens and stuff, those are awesome plays. But they're 50-50 balls for a reason. You know what I'm saying? You're not always going to be able to rely on those. So Johnson plays a really important role for the Steelers offense, even if he can be, a little bit polarizing at times. In terms of Allen Robinson, man, I'm very intrigued on how this is going to work, because he, I think if you're looking at his outside production, he's almost a little bit similar to Pickens, just in terms of they both have really strong hands. They both can win vertical, Pickens has a little bit more speed, especially at this stage of his career. Robinson's definitely lost a step, in my opinion, and he was never that fast to begin with. But they're both really good with the ball in the air, excellent body control guys, can box guys out, bigger targets. Um, One of the things that I really, really like about Allen Robinson, and I pointed this out after we signed him, but I just really love the way that he can operate in zone coverage. He's good at reading multiple defenders, and that's a big part of playing in the slot. You've got to read multiple defenders at the same exact time. And Robinson does that extremely well. And I think that could help Pickett potentially maybe work the middle of the field a little bit better and find those voids in the coverage. I think having another veteran in the room, a guy for George Pickens to kind of bounce ideas off of and kind of help him learn some of the more nuances of the game. Robinson's always been really good against press. He's a good route runner. I think that this is a very low risk move. I know he played, I think a third or so of his snaps in the slot last year with the Rams. I'm interested to see how it works if he does have to play there 60% of the time or something like that, because that would be a pretty drastic shift from what he's used to. So
See it being
overall,
similar
go
to
ahead.
the Jericho Cotchery signing back in like
Mm-hmm.
2011, and just
And that
how
was awesome.
yes,
That was awesome. So yeah, shoot, man. How many touchdowns did Cotchery catch that 1 year? It was like
I think
2013,
I
2012,
think
2013,
I think it
2013.
was I think it was. I'm looking it
It
up
had
right
to be
now.
close to double digits, man. It was like every time Ben was getting inside the 20, it was going to 89.
Looking it up right now. He had 10 touchdowns that year.
Right on the money, double digits.
Yep.
Yeah, that's a good shout, man. That would be awesome. If that signing ended up working out like that, even if it's just kind of a 1 year thing. I know Robinson has a astronomical cap hit next season. I don't know what they would do about his contract. He can't play on what he's got right now. So,
That yeah, and that's where
which Calvin
it's
Austin kind of factors
yeah.
in there. Like they probably need to see, what kind of role could this dude potentially have moving forward. Just in general, before we spend too much time on the receiver group, um, you know, do you think we'll talk a little bit about the tight ends because they play into this, but do you think this receiver group is substantial for a rookie quarterback taking his kind of year two leap? Do you think they've got enough weapons on offense with this mainly the top three that they've got? You think that this is a good supporting cast for Pickett?
I think this is about as good of a supporting cast as you can have going into year two of if you're trying to make a year two jump, like there should be almost no excuses looking at the roster in terms of just like talent at the skill positions. Obviously, I hate that term now. It doesn't really work, but
Right.
the wide receiver room is extremely deep. There's still some unproven talent, like with guys like Calvin Austin that intrigue you. Even Akeem Butler could make, he could play a role into Allen Robinson's, contract for next year as well, because he fits more of that big bodied guy who can kind of, you know, play in the middle of the field a little more, even though Calvin Austin not afraid to make a tough catch in traffic and stuff like that. But there's going to be an interesting, it's going to be interesting to look at the roster as a whole, because I definitely think on paper there's way more talent than most quarterbacks have going into year two.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I don't want to say that this is a top five receiver room or anything like that because I don't believe that that's the case. And,
It's not
you know,
proven enough yet.
yeah. And I think you can look around the league and see the advantages of having that, kind of alpha dog dominant wide receiver one. I think Deontay Johnson is probably like a top 15-ish receiver in the league, but there's definitely advantages to having the Justin Jeffersons over, having three quality receivers. I feel like the Steelers have. And while they don't have that, I still think that they've done a good job creating a positive infrastructure for a young quarterback. And I think that is wholly important, man. Like you said, there's a lot of young quarterbacks that get put in really, really tough situations. And I know the play calling, the offensive coordinator situation in Pittsburgh is not the greatest and not the most ideal thing in the world. But I think when you look at what's on paper in between the lines, if everybody's healthy, heading into 2023, I think there's a lot to be excited about in terms of just helping him develop and hopefully reaching his ceiling. So, um, let's kind of move on to the tight end group. This is a group, man, I'm really freaking excited about. But I wanted to get your thoughts on, I think that there's some talk about maybe are they keeping three tight ends? Are they keeping four tight ends? Is Connor Hayward still a tight end? Was he ever a tight end? I don't know. How do you see this kind of room shaping out and as it relates to, who's going to be on the 53?
So I kind of went through the roster. It was kind of hard to fit a fourth tight end onto the roster just looking at other parts. But you mentioned Connor Hayward. He definitely is more of the receiver type as opposed to the, blocking receiver type. And I definitely think it's going to be interesting because they have more depth at receiver this year than they did going into last year, where they were really strapped and they had to use Hayward a little bit as a pseudo slot receiver at times, and he made some good plays. He has some good hands for him for sure, but you know, you might want more of that traditional tight end and a guy like Zach Gentry potentially as the third, or maybe try to fit him as the fourth tight end if you want Connor Hayward on the roster. But I'm definitely leaning towards Hayward. I just think he's a better talent overall, and I think for me, I just think talent wins out in that area.
Hmm. So you're leaning towards them only keeping three and
Yeah,
Zach off the roster and Hayward on?
yes, currently,
Okay, gotcha.
but I could definitely be wrong here. This one's a coin flip for me.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I think it is a little shaky, right? I think they got some decisions to make. I think one of the things about Hayward, I think that he could do some. w- I am careful about how I'm phrasing this, but I think if Fryermuth was to go down with an injury, he's another guy. He's had three concussions already in the first 2 years of his career. I think that Hayward's probably the guy on the roster right now that could take on some of his slot receiver work.
Yeah,
Obviously, Allen Robinson, they could shift those responsibilities to the receivers, but then you get into different personnel groupings. Defenses respond with different personnel groupings. So you have to change kind of the landscape a little bit of that. But Hayward can do some of those things. You mentioned the hands, the ability to catch the ball away from his frame. That was something that really stuck out to me on his college tape in training camp last year, preseason, into the regular season. Made some good catches. Also, Hayward, big time special teamer. So that I definitely think plays way into his advantage in terms of when you compare him up against Zach Gentry, who's not really a factor in that regard.
yeah,
Now, Gentry does have more of the traditional tight end body type. Hayward has some limitations being, 5'10" and 235 pounds. There are some things that he cannot do as an inline blocker. It's not that he doesn't want to do it. It's just from a build perspective, he just isn't built like that. You can't sit there and ask him to block 290-pound defensive ends or 275-pound edge rushers. It's not a realistic expectation. So with Gentry, I would not personally classify him as a plus blocker. I think he is an adequate run blocker, but just his size in general allows him to kind of hold up or at least lose slowly in that regard. So um, I'm not really sure if they'd keep three or four, man. The thing that gives me pause about them potentially keeping four is there's no real fullback on the roster right now. So I wonder if Hayward kind of handles that.
yeah. That's definitely something that they could use with Connor Hayward. But I've also been thinking, I had some thoughts about this the other day, and when I saw people, there was some interesting discussions about, like, the fullback coming back, and I thought a little bit about what Hakeem Butler could do is as like just being able to kind of be used in a bunch of different roles, because teams tried to switch him to tight end after he got cut by the Cardinals, and he ended up lasting not very long, but his blocking ability is still a big plus, especially as a receiver, and you could see him move a lot around the formation. And I think you could maybe kill two birds with one stone type of thing if he was able to make the roster potentially. I'm just thinking a little bit out loud about things that they could do with Akeem Butler, because I definitely think there's something they could try
Yeah.
with him.
I didn't even think about that. That is a good shout because I remember Butler coming out. That was one of the strengths kind of on his scouting report was that he was a pretty adequate. He was a pretty solid blocker on the outside. He really. I went back and watched one of his games a couple months ago, and he really gets after it in that regard. So that is a good shout. I think when you look at some of the things that the Chiefs did last year in 13 personnel, they were extremely explosive. They were extremely efficient in 13 personnel. I think close to like 10% of the time on offense. I mean, it was a significant number of snaps. And I think the NFL is kind of learning to get more creative with some of their personnel groupings. Could the Steelers, use some of that to their advantage with this group? I definitely think so. Um, let's talk a little bit about Darnell Washington and Pat Fryermuth. You know, Pat, I feel like he's already one of the. I mean, he can't be any lower than top 10. I feel like receiving tight ends in the league. He's really good at working out of the slot, finding the soft area against zone coverage, good hands. Pat was also their best player yards after catch wise last year, which is probably surprising to some. But the Steelers were really bad in that regard, and Pat made some huge plays. You think back to that huge catch and run against the Falcons late in the season. But I think just the pairing of Darnell Washington, man, allowing Fryermuth to focus a little bit more on just being a receiver, catching passes, and bringing in Darnell Washington kind of as that second tight end. That's what has me super, super intrigued about this position group.
Yeah, for sure. Darnell Washington's blocking ability is something I'm so excited to watch, especially watch his technique grow over time because a lot of times he was just dominating guys with his pure, just unrelenting strength that he had. Just being able to generate as much power as he does, it's gonna be fun to watch him.
Yeah. Yeah, the ability to kind of just mold him and see what the ceiling is, because man, it's pretty untapped. I feel like it's super, super sky high, because he's really just kind of winning off athleticism a little bit right now, and I think that could potentially be a huge thing for the Steelers offense. Could help them in the run game. There's some stuff you can do with the pass game with him as well. Get him out in the flats. He's never going to be a high level route runner. I will, continue to say that. I know we talked about that on the draft pod, but still, I'm very intrigued by what this team could potentially do in 12, maybe even some 13 personnel looks. Um, let's move on to the tackles. All right. I think this one's kind of obvious in terms of where they're going for the 53. Chooks is a lock. Dan Moore is a lock. Broderick Jones a lock. But I think the question comes into who's going to win that starting job between Dan Moore and Broderick Jones.
Yeah, for sure. That one's definitely big, but I definitely think Dan Moore and Broderick Jones will be competing, but I definitely think at some point the Steelers might evaluate their options between Dan Moore and Chusa for because I definitely think they're way closer than people want to give them credit for. Because a lot of people will look at the raw sack numbers given up by Dan Moore and they'll say, oh, Dan Moore is definitely a lot worse than Chukwueze for, but they're very similar, and I definitely think Dan Moore actually might provide more as just an overall run blocker, which is an
Agreed.
area that Chooks just doesn't really give me a lot to be excited about because I just don't think he's that much of a mauler. He's like that explosive mover in space.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, I think that you've got to at least acknowledge that, if Moore is going to be the swing tackle this year, which I think that's probably what ends up happening sooner rather than later. Broderick may not start week 1. We'll see what happens. I think they're going to give him every opportunity to win that job. Um, but I think what's interesting for me is how he performs. Do they give him reps at left and right in preseason training camp? I'm interested to see that. He did play some on the right side his rookie year in preseason, right? If I remember correctly. Um,
Yeah.
But I do agree with you. I don't think there's this massive gap between him and a Okorafor. I really don't believe that. Okorafor does some good things in terms of getting out of his snap. He's a better pass protector than run blocker, where he really doesn't add a ton of value. More adds a little bit more in the run game. He's also cheaper at this point. With 2 years left on his rookie contract. But let's talk a little bit about Broderick Jones. What are your expectations? Let's just go ahead and say Broderick wins the job week 1. What are your expectations for him as a rookie?
As a rookie, I'm definitely tempering my expectations overall. I definitely think one thing that the Steelers are going to have to do, though, they want to give him help as much as they can.
Hmm.
Because a lot of times when offensive tackles seem to have good rookie seasons, unless they're like Tristan Wirfs level of that level of just amazing, talent and technique, but I think Broderick Jones is much more raw in that regard, and his body is still developing. There's a lot of things that he still needs to work out, but the potential is sky high. To have him, come through on that potential, you might want to, try and give him help, especially in his first season, because he's going to be he's gonna feel overwhelmed at times with some of his some of his responsibilities in terms of what he has to do, but also just the amount of pass rushers he's going to face because he's got quite the load to start the season with
Hmm.
Nick Bosa if he does end up playing. But for me, I'm tempering my expectations as low as they can be for year one because a lot of times some of the best offensive tackles in the league, they have some of the worst rookie seasons. Andrew Thomas is a very,
Prime example.
very prime example of that. And I just think it's really hard, especially when you're more raw with your technique, to be. He was more of a two-hand puncher, and Pat Meyer is way it preaches more independent hand
Independent hand
usage,
usage. Yep.
and you know, he's definitely got to work on that in that regard. But where I'm excited to see him is when the Steelers run power or counter and try and get him on the move in space because he is going to absolutely put guys on highlight reels in space with his ability to just pull and just he can maul guys out in space. It's going to be
Yep.
fun watching him reach the second level. I think that's going to make for some very fun film viewing appointments for sure.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, I definitely think, with Washington and Broderick Jones, you can just turn on the Georgia tape and immediately understand kind of how you can weaponize them in the run game. And that's what I'm really excited about, man. Getting both those guys out in space, they have good targeting systems. They can
Yeah,
lock on to some of these smaller defensive backs, some of these smaller linebackers, and just how athletic they are. In terms of Jones, and just expectations for his rookie season. I think that, like you said, you got to temper expectations, man. That's the tackle transition to the league is so freaking difficult, and even for a guy who, like Broderick Jones, didn't technically allow a sack in college, um, there were definitely you could pop on the film against some of the better rushers that he faced. Most notably Missouri's Isaiah McGuire is
plays for
one
the
that
Browns
comes,
now.
yeah, it is one that comes to mind. And you can see that he was winning off of raw ability and athleticism, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's one of the reasons why he got taken in the top 15, right? One of the reasons that the Steelers traded up to get him, because that raw ability and the athleticism and the traits are what make you so excited about his potential ceiling down the road. But he's going to have to work on the hand usage. He's a little late to the party. Lets some guys get into his chest. But he has a good anchor. That's one of the things that he has over Dan Moore really already, in my opinion, is a little bit better recovery ability. I think Broderick could be really, really good in that regard, as well as being a good run blocker. So I'm excited about Broderick. I think that they're just going to give him every opportunity to win the job, but I could also see a scenario where things start out pretty rough in terms of early on. You're going to have to give him some help, especially in obvious passing situations. One of the things that really helps your tackles, I think, the establish the run mantra that some of the old kind of coaches used to really, lean into heavily is a little bit misguided. it is good when you can run the football. It does help your tackles and pass protection, but the big part of that is you have to be able to make pass rushers guess. You cannot allow them to get in situations where they can sit there and tee off. If it's 3rd and 8, 3rd and 9, 3rd and 10, and it's an obvious passing situation, if you're putting Broderick Jones in those situations early on against the Nick Bosa's, the Myles Garrett's, the guys like that, that's not a good way for him to have success early on. You
Yeah.
got to make sure you're staying ahead of the chains. Make sure you're giving him a little bit of help early on until he kind of, you know, continues to refine some of his technical issues. So, but I'm excited about Broderick going forward. I do agree that rookie season is definitely he's gonna take his lumps a little bit, and that's okay. Um, let's talk a little bit about the interior offensive line before we kind of head out of here and wrap this thing up. Um, I'm excited about this group, man. I think the starters are set. I wanted to hear your thoughts. Let's get to some of the backups along the offensive line first before we get into the starters on the interior. Who are some backups you're interested in?
I'm most interested in Spencer Anderson because I was looking around the roster and I don't see a ton of guys who can really play all the positions along the offensive line, play inside and out. And I think that's a big thing that Spencer Anderson can provide and might get him onto the roster.
Mm-hmm.
And he played right tackle, he played at guard, he definitely has a lot of that versatility you want to see, and he was a great athlete as well. So I definitely think there's a really good opportunity for Spencer Anderson to make this roster because guys like Nate Herbig, they're not exactly like the type of movers that you would want, especially at like tackle or they're the mauling guard presence, but that's the big thing. And Kendrick Green, he's a little bit on the bubble as well. He's not the type of player who can play offensive tackle either. He's more confined to the interior at this point in terms of the type of size he has. He's very limited in that regard. So this is definitely a great opportunity for Spencer Anderson to make the roster. And I watched the Raven Clark play um this past season, and
I watched the Dallas game. Maybe was that the one I watched?
he was probably worse than Dennis Daly, and that is saying something for Tennessee because they had some of the worst blocking I've seen all year that I watched.
It was bad
It's,
over there.
yeah, it was brutal, and I'm not exactly thinking LaRaven Clark should make the roster based off size alone, but obviously I can be wrong in that regard. But I'm not really expecting much out of him, but we'll see, how the end of the depth plays out. But I definitely think they want to prioritize versatility more than anything.
Yeah, Clark's a veteran. He's been around a little bit. I do think that gives him a little bit of a leg up if they do elect to keep 4 traditional tackles and leave that last guy kind of um, you know maybe inactive on game days. But I think Spencer Anderson, like you said, he has a really good opportunity on his hands. He played all 5 positions in college. He played over, I think it was like 300 and something snaps at center, right guard, right tackle. They just kept moving him around basically wherever they needed him that particular year throughout his career at Maryland. So a good athlete. He's probably the guy that I'm most excited to see. Even if I don't know if he'll end up making the roster, he's a late round draft pick, so we never know with that. But he could be a really interesting piece to kind of mold for the future. Probably not going to play very much. You definitely don't want him playing that much because that means you've got some injuries up front, which is never good. But um, speaking of injuries, they started the same 5 offensive linemen really all year last year, and that
Not,
just does not ever happen. So
yeah,
that's why we wanted to talk about some of these backup guys, Spencer Anderson, Nate Herbig. We'll see what happens with Kendrick Green, Kevin Dotson. We're more familiar with those guys because they've been here over the past couple of years. But Dotson I think is an interesting one too because if Herbig is kind of your swing interior guy, your top backup, I don't think that you can justify really keeping Kevin Dotson here. And that's not because, he definitely belongs on a 53-man roster. It's because I think he can start on some other teams around the league because Dotson has some of those highs mixed in with some inconsistencies that another coaching staff could believe they can, kind of fix. And I think the Steelers could get, a day 3 pick out of that equation for a guy that may or may not dress on game day. So I think they'd have to weigh the options there. But again, that's all contingent on them leaving training camp and leaving the summer fully healthy, right? Like that's a big thing.
Yeah.
Sam Alo's had a little bit of issues staying healthy over the course of his career, so that's something to monitor. Um, let's talk about the starters, though. I'm really intrigued by this group. I think that the guard position in general is a strength of not just this offense, but I think this team. What are your
Yes.
thoughts on that?
I completely agree. Somalu is one of the better guards in the league, and James Daniels, he was definitely their best offensive lineman down the stretch last season. Definitely could see this being not only a strength of the group, but maybe like a strength within the league. The probably the biggest weakness in the interior is center right now with Mason Cole, who is not a bad player, but there's definitely some room for improvement. I know he was dealing with an injury down the stretch that led to a little bit of his inconsistent play at times, but for me, I just don't think he provides a level of athleticism that the Steelers typically want out of their centers, especially as run blockers. So I definitely think he's a little more limited in that regard, but excited about Samalu and Daniels. And say what you want about Kevin Dotson and Nate Herbig, if they were both, going into training camp knowing that there's no injuries right now, if injuries were to happen, it feels pretty decent to have a guy like Dotson or and Nate Herbig sitting on the training camp roster right now, in
Yeah,
case if things went south very quickly. And I think that's a big thing, and probably why the Steelers have not traded Kevin Dotson yet. But we could see them maybe do that like towards the end of training camp, towards
yeah.
the end of preseason.
Yeah, absolutely, man. I think that that's a huge thing, right? Like just being able to have experienced veterans, kind of waiting in the wings in the event of a disaster is a huge thing. And I know Dotson's, frustrating the penalties, the inconsistent play, but I think that there's going to be a team out there that's definitely going to call them if he has especially if he has a strong preseason. He's going to be going up against backups, so I kind of anticipate him showing out a little bit too. Um, so that's really interesting. In terms of the backup center spot, that's the only thing I wanted to hit on before we kind of get out of here for the first half of this 53-man roster prediction. Um, who is the backup center right now? If something does happen to Mason Cole, he did deal with some injuries last year. Is it Spencer Anderson? Do you think Kendrick Green? Is that how he makes the roster? I'm interested to see what your thoughts are there.
Um, Possibility it could be Kendrick Green. Spencer Anderson would make sense as well. I wouldn't count out Ryan McCollum, who they signed, played some bit for the Lions, was undrafted, I believe, for the Texans, and he didn't make the roster, but the Lions signed him, and I think he played a little bit for them down the stretch. Definitely, just the fact he played a little bit might, entice the Steelers for sure. And I definitely think just giving Kendrick Green any sort of competition is a good thing, because his rookie season lives rent free in a lot of our minds in
Yeah,
terms of just how brutal it was watching him just get run over. Just it was brutal, especially. But there's one thing we have to remember: players do improve, and I think it'll be key to watch how Kendrick Green performs in this training camp. Watching his hand usage particularly, and how see if
his
that's improved.
balance.
His balance is yes, balance
It's a
is the
big thing.
big thing, because he ended up on his butt way too much as a rookie,
Yeah.
and
Yeah,
but
and even that transition to guard last year wasn't what I think a lot of people were hoping for,
yeah,
and kind of highlighted the reason why those position switches aren't always this kind of cure all end all be all type of serum for guys that struggle early on. So, but yeah, I'm very interested to see. That's probably the one spot that I feel a little bit shaky on, just in terms of what would happen in the event of an injury. I think Dan Moore, if he's called upon, you feel at least somewhat comfortable that he's going to be able to come in and just not completely wreck your entire game plan. Um, and then, with the guards you mentioned, I think that that's a position of strength in terms of depth. So the center spot, a little bit shaky.
looking
Um,
looking like their first round pick option for
for
This
2024. Yeah, we'll have
yeah,
to get
already
on
look.
here and talk some center prospects. Yeah, I'm excited about that too. But yeah, I appreciate you guys for tapping in with us and listening to me and Nick ramble on for an hour about some Steelers football. It's always a good time getting together with you, brother. I appreciate you again for jumping on the channel with me.
Yes,
And
sir.
hopefully I'm able to, get you on here, at least a couple more times, throughout the season.
Yes, sir. It'll be. I'd love to be on here as much as possible. Maybe we could do a, podcast at some point talking about what we watched during the summer and what type of prospects. I wanna share notes and stuff like that. It'll be
Yeah.
fun.
Yeah, definitely itching to get some NFL draft content out there. It's just there's some things preventing that at the moment, but we'll
Be
talk
like,
a little bit about that at a later date.
mhm.
But yeah, I appreciate you guys for tapping in with us. Please just make sure again, like the video, drop me a comment, let me know what you guys thought of the different position groups, some guys that you think are gonna shoot for that 53-man roster. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, all of that good stuff, and I will check you guys next time. Peace.